1940s, the tropical paradise of Colombia.
The universal language, and most of the people are of the Roman Catholic faith.
With the end of World War II finally at the horizon, Colombia would share common grounds with the United States of America, being that Colombia had access to both the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. Troops were stationed as a strategic point of access. In April 1948, Tolima, Colombia, a woman by the name of Benilda and a man by the name of Midardo was expecting a child to be due in 6 months. Before Midardo was able to meet his own son, he was shot and killed by an unknown assailant, leaving Pedro to soon be born into this world fatherless. This was the start of the Colombian Civil War, also known as La Violencia.
Así pasó, el diablo metió la cola. Así pasó, el diablo metió la cola. Y ahora el hombre y la mujer no pueden dar pie con bola. Se van Caimán, se van Caimán. Se va para Barranquilla, se van Caimán, se van Caimán. Se va para Barranquilla. A contarles voy, señores, las cosas que hizo Satán. A contarles voy, señores, las cosas que hizo Satán.
6 months later, Pedro was finally born. Being the 9th child out of 16, Pedro was born into poverty. Oftentimes, Pedro's mother would sell her body in exchange for money. From a very young age, Pedro would recall seeing his mother having sexual intercourse with clients and would often suffer from domestic violence on numerous occasions. When Pedro was only 8 years old, his mother would catch him molesting his younger sister. As a result, Pedro was kicked out of the house, unable to return. No clothes, no food, no shelter. A few days later, Pedro would find his way back into the house. His mother would then sit him on a bus, making him get off miles away from his town. He was officially on his own. Days would pass and Pedro would eventually grow weary, where one day, Pedro would meet a man who promised him hot meals and a place to rest his head. The random stranger had promised to take the boy off the streets and help him find a new home. That's when the mysterious man would proceed to take him to an abandoned warehouse, where Pedro was repeatedly sodomized over and over again. As a result of the molestation, Pedro would soon join a local street gang for his own protection. The gang would usually fight each other for food, money, and shelter, and often smoked bazuco, a drug derived from cocaine. When Pedro turned 12 years old, he was adopted by an elderly couple who enrolled him into a school for orphans. The couple stated they felt extremely bad for Pedro and wanted to help him in any way they possibly could. But it wasn't long until Pedro would eventually run away, claiming he was being molested by one of the male teachers there. For the next 6 years, Pedro would indulge in a life of crime, committing robberies and vehicle thefts as a means to survive. This would ultimately land him in prison by the age of 18. During his incarceration, Pedro was brutally gang raped by 4 other inmates. He would eventually hunt and kill the inmates during his incarceration, claiming it was an act of self-defense. 2 more years were added to his overall sentence, and Pedro would finally be released in 1977. After his prison sentence, Pedro would begin to lure and kill young girls all across Peru. He would detail searching for a young girl with a certain look of innocence and happiness in her face. He would often lure the child with toys and trinkets before forcefully abducting them and taking them in the forest. His method of slaying his victims were all mostly the same. He would sodomize the girls for hours before strangling them, but only during the sunrise. Pedro claimed he needed to see their eyes before taking their lives. He stated it was a complete waste to kill in the nighttime and would explicitly wait until the sun rose to strangle his victims. He would usually lead a child to a shallow grave, where they were often shocked to see previous victims inside already deceased. Pedro stated he would often talk to the corpse, propping their bodies up and having parties into the night. He also stated he spent a long time making sure the victims were dead, sometimes having to kill them again, slitting their wrists and their throat after strangling them. Pedro also confessed his urge to abduct the children of tourists that often visit Peru, but stated their parents were always too watchful. By 1978, Pedro had claimed he had killed over 100 young girls in the span of just 1 year, roughly equating to 2 girls per week for the entire year. Pedro would soon be caught by a native tribe called the Ayacucho when trying to lure yet another child from their community. Pedro was caught, and his time had finally arrived. He was set to be executed and recalls being covered in honey and buried up to his neck. This way, the ants will eat him alive, causing a slow and agonizing death. It wasn't long until a female Christian missionary intervened and persuaded the tribe to allow the police to handle Pedro's punishment. They reluctantly agreed. Pedro was put in the back of her jeep and instructed to be taken straight to Peruvian authorities. She would eventually drive him to the border and let him go. Now that Pedro was a free man, he relocated from Colombia to Ecuador and continued his vicious cycle. In 1979, a river would overflow in a local town called Ambato, and the bodies of 4 young girls were washed up on the riverbank. Police noted that each child had been strangled to the point of which their eyes were bulging out of their sockets, and one had a distinct look of fear on her face. It wasn't until 1980 where Pedro was arrested for trying to abduct a 12-year-old girl from the Plaza Rose market in Ecuador. He was briefly jailed and put under investigation. Police had a feeling that Pedro was their guy, but needed proof to put him away. So, they decided to send Detective Gonzalez undercover inside of Pedro's cell for 27 days. Detective Gonzalez stated he befriended Pedro under the ruse that he too was a rapist, and the two began sharing stories. The detective stated that Pedro would often boast about the murders in Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. He was eventually found guilty of the murders and confessed to killing hundreds of young children year after year. Pedro would soon take police to the grave sites of 53 victims but refused to help any further. He would often take police to locations where no bodies were recovered, but this was theorized that local wildlife had eaten or displaced the corpse. Since Ecuador had abolished the death penalty in 1906, the maximum sentence Pedro could have possibly faced was 20 years. After serving 18 years, Pedro was released on good behavior. In 1999, Pedro was escorted to the Colombian border by police, where he was protected from angry families of the slain victims. He was given clothes, water, and money before being released and was told to never return. And so, the monster was free, yet again. Families in Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru were all aware of Pedro's release, leaving families on high alert, watching after their young ones and keeping them close by. Radio shows received call after call claiming possible sightings and a cry for help, requesting Pedro be arrested and trialed again. This would lead to a short revolution to reinstate the death penalty in Ecuador, but nothing had ever changed. Ever since Pedro was deported back to Colombia, no one had heard of him since. No possible sightings, no more missing children. No one knows if he's dead or alive. And so, Pedro received the nickname the Monster of the Andes.